Good morning. I'm making this presentation. I'm focusing this presentation on some laboratory experimental methods we can use to address some emerging problems in hydrology, water, and the environment. So I had to try to categorize the type of problems the hydrologists and water engineers are involved under these six categories. Starting with potable water, the potable water is the sustainability of good quality water is one of the problems, one of the big challenges. And the second one is the global warming, and the global warming has a lot of hydrology and water implications. And the third one is the health, which is related to poor water and the climate issues. And the fourth one is the food security and the water energy nexus, natural disasters such as floods, droughts, and tsunamis, and potable water and again I mentioned potable water. So all these problems has a dimensions of water. So I want to make a few observations to sort of orient ourselves into this talk. So the numerical models can be used to address some of these problems. So the question still remains how good these models are, are these models ability to capture these processes when the processes become very complex. So then how do we validate these models is another question asked. And then what are the characteristics and information which goes into these models? And finally, the issue of scales. When we develop models, we develop parameters at a smaller measurement scale, so observation scales, and try to apply these into larger scale. This is a classical, what I call upscaling problems. So the primary thesis of this my presentation is how carefully designed and theory-driven experiments at various test scales can play a central role in providing answers to critical scientific questions, and how they will help to fill knowledge gaps to address emerging problems in hydrology and water. So I want to emphasize the fact that when you do experiments has to be theory-driven. So what this means is that the experiment, before you design the experiment, you need to design the experiment based on a good understanding of the theory. Otherwise, this will be very challenging to interpret the results and make any sense out of the data. So there are many challenging problems in hydrology and water are involving interfaces. I'm taking some examples. First one is the water-air interface, which is we quite familiar with, which is the water table. And the second one I'm showing here, the saturated and the unsaturated zone first interface. Second one is a saturated unsaturated water interface, which is the water table. And the third one, the river aquifer interface, which is when you're modeling rivers and aquifer like conjunctive use, surface subsurface management, this interface become important. And the fourth one is the water and in this case non-aqueous phase liquid interface. So this has to do with trapping of chemicals and like supercritical CO2 in subsurface carbon sequestration. And then the next one is land-ocean interface, and then land-atmospheric interface, and and snow and atmosphere interface. So these are all happening at interfaces. So I'm going to, in my talk today, I'm going to focus on two of these interfaces, the water supercritical CO2 interface and land-atmospheric interface. So to introduce the methods I have been using, I'll use this figure to explain. On the left-hand side, you have the post scale. So all the fundamental processes we like to understand happen at the post scale. And always to remember that the post scale is three-dimensional. And then the field is also three-dimensional. And then the whole idea is to understand how do we use this understanding of what's happening at a smaller scale and to apply to 3D field scale using models. So as you see that the problems get complex as you go from the pore scale to the field case. So in this particular figure, I'm showing two zones. The light blue zone is the atmosphere, because one of the problems I'm going to be looking at involves the atmosphere as one of the domains. And the second problem is the porous medium. So that is below this line. So if you look at the porous medium, the complexity of the problems in the porous medium come from the dimensionality, because most of the time we do experiments, so we do experiments moving from this scale to this scale. We do experiments in using 2D models, 3D models, 1D columns. Similarly, we do 1D models, 2D models, and 3D models. So that the dimensionality becomes very important, that because when you characterize the system using 1D experiment, how do I use that in the 3D field? And second one is the heterogeneity. So subsurface is naturally heterogeneous, and then when you try to model this in the field system, we have to use heterogeneity. And in the atmospheric system, the atmosphere is always three-dimensional also, but atmosphere is material-wise very homogeneous, but it becomes heterogeneous because of the vapor and thermal processing. So what I'm going to talk about today is a scale called intermediate scale. This is a scale I believe we can do, actually we have shown do interesting experiments to address the problems of the 3D field, as well as how to move from this scale to this scale. So the intermediate scale is a scale intermediary between the column and the field scales. And we normally define the scale to be 1 to 10 meters. So this is a scale where the field scale processes can be mimicked under controlled conditions. So this is some of the test facilities we have been using in our research. These are three-dimensional and two-dimensional tanks, and then we have various control systems. There are a lot of sensors, and you can control the boundary conditions, initial conditions, etc. So there are 3 points I want to make in this particular slide. So when you develop models, these models are some sort of partial differential equation where the initial conditions and boundary conditions has been known. So in the field, it's very difficult to control an initial condition, boundary condition, especially if you are trying to develop databases to validate theories and models. We need to have a really good understanding, good quantification of the initial and boundary condition. And the second issue is the characterization. So when you go to the field, especially in the subsurface, it is very difficult to characterize these systems. Whatever information you obtain to design heterogeneity come from cores or wells, and these are always going to be spaced apart. If you're looking at very large systems, you won't have all the data. So the third one is the third point I want to make is that it's very difficult to get precise data in the field to get a fundamental understanding of these problems. So I'm going to take two timely problems related to global warming and food-water nexus to demonstrate how this type of test can be used to address challenges and capitalize on some opportunities. The first example I'm going to take is on carbon sequestration. The carbon sequestration is to mitigate greenhouse gas loading into the atmosphere. And the second one is the opportunities. So I'm going to look at the problem of energy and mass flux on the atmospheric interplays as applied to climate change. So this particular figure you see on the left-hand side come from the IPCC 2005 report, where they identify the different mechanisms of trapping. So the idea here is that you take CO2 and then you inject into deep saline formations with the expectation that this is going to stay there for thousands of years, and that way you take the gas which is normally going to the atmosphere into the subsurface. So you can see the injection period can be about 20 to 40 years, and the post-injection periods maybe hundreds of years. And then we are looking at this system to stay 1,000 years. So you can say 4 types of trapping mechanism: the structural trapping, and the residual trapping, and the solubility trapping, and mineral trapping. So actually, I'm going to focus more on the structural trapping today, so just to demonstrate how the experiments can be used to address some of these problems. So this particular figure you see down here is actually from the world's first commercial site on carbon storage. And so this one, actually, they had taken pictures of this the evolution of this trapping process. And the idea here is that if you have a very fine formation and a coarser formation, and there's a transition of the interface texture, then due to capillary barrier effects, this fluid going to get trapped. So this is basically what's happening in this system. So the objective of this particular example I'm going to take is to say how we can use this entrapment mechanism or the heterogeneity to our advantage to increase trapping. So in the case of carbon sequestration, the heterogeneity can be used to advantage, but in the case of non-aqueous phase liquids like groundwater contamination due to petroleum-based solvents, that problem we like to take the contaminant out as much as possible, because it's going to stay and become long-term source of contamination. So this particular experiment I'm going to describe here is conducted in an 8-foot long and 4 feet high tank. It's a two-dimensional tank where we pack the tank with a completely homogeneous, because I'm trying to make the argument that with the heterogeneity I can enhance entrapment. So in this particular case, one of the challenges in this problem is that when carbon CO2 is injected into the subsurface, it is behaving like under the subsurface high pressure condition is going to stay like a fluid. But when you try to do this experiment in the ambient condition in the lab, it is going to be a gas. So some of the literature people who had done this type of work, they do these control experiments in the laboratory and ambient laboratory condition by using very high artificial pressures to keep the fluid as a liquid. So what we have done here is actually we have selected some what are called surrogate fluids. So these fluids, we can select these fluid combinations in a way that we can use the viscosity ratio and other dimensionless groups, so that this fluid combination under ambient laboratory conditions behave like what you expect in the field. So we have actually demonstrated this using models where we simulated the real supercritical CO2, and then we simulate our analog fluids, and we will get the same results. So in this particular experiment, what we did was we filled the tank with a homogeneous soil, and this is a cap rock, and we injected this analog fluid at the bottom, and then there's another second fluid which is acting like the brine. And then when we inject it, and because supercritical CO2 is a lighter fluid, it actually migrates upwards by buoyancy, and they started moving horizontally this way. And then now the second figure is where we packed the tank, the same tank, with a spatial correlated random field. We took 5 soils of different hydraulic orders of magnitude different hydraulic conductivity, and used some geostatistical parameters and create this random field. And we took the same amount of fluid here, and we injected it. You can see, just visually looking at this figure, you can see that in this case, the homogeneous case, the fluid just escapes and then got out of here. And in the previous case, in this case, it got trapped in these pools with high saturated pools. So in our laboratory, we have actually a way of measuring these things, quantify these things using what we call using an X-ray attenuation system. We shoot X-rays to the tank, and then we can actually get these nice saturation profiles. As you see from the color from this homogeneous tank, most of the fluid actually really escaped here. So you can look at this situation as some sort of fracture in the cap rock with this escape. Now you can see here, this is stably entrapped, and this didn't move. This is the same volume got trapped in this case, and you can see very high saturations at these locations. Okay, now to interpret these results, what we did was in this particular graph, I took the tank vertically so I can define the length along the tank from the source, from the point of injection along the tank this way. And then I took the center of mass of this plume. So the center of mass will tell you how fast the total mass of the system moves. So I'm plotting the center of mass, location of the center of mass on this axis, and then on this axis I'm looking at the time. As you see, when you start, the injection started here, center of mass was here. As time goes, center start moving up, moving down, and as you see this way, the saturation, the center of mass goes down because it's it's smaller and smaller and smaller. I'm saying larger and larger and larger, because actually this is a negative number. And as you go down here, then at least about 1500 hours, in 1500 hours, it's completely stopped. So this is completely immobilized after 15 hours. So actually we ran this experiment. This experiment stayed about 3 years after this experiment was done, and still we saw that nothing had mobilized. So this is a good thing. So we were able to actually show that the entrapment can be enhanced by using heterogeneity. So actually we have done other work trying to develop injection schemes to using the same ideas to see what is the way, how do we inject things so that we can capitalize on this heterogeneity. So I'm going to go to the second example, which is to do with the mass and the energy transfer for the land atmosphere interface. There are a number of problems which involve this interface, but I'm going to focus on this one problem, which has to do with the climate change. So this is actually a so this problem has to do with land atmosphere, plant atmosphere continuum, food security. If you look at this map, I'll get back in a minute, but you can see that one of the drivers for this studying this problem is that the global population is going to increase, and then due to climate change, some of these areas in the world are going to have very high water scarcity. And then you can see the food production need to increase by 60% to meet this population needs, global needs, and then by 2030, these 2/3 of the global population will also be suffer from effects of increased water stress. So you can look at this map, you can immediately see some of the high water stress areas are also the areas where they are going to have very high needs of food. The food security is associated with part of Africa and parts here. So also there's another interesting observation is that the family farms produce 80% of the world food. So if you can find a way of making water efficient in these small farms, then actually this can have a fairly large impact. So for this, we actually, to develop this idea, so we actually published a paper on this National Academy paper where we talk in more details, and if you're interested, you can read this paper. But the idea is here, that if you go to arid zone, and some of these pictures are taken at different parts of the world, you can see the plants seem to be randomly distributed. But if you look at the distances, their average distances have some correlation to the climate and available water resources. So what we thought was that what is the reason for these plants to grow in this spacing? So this is an experiment we could do in the laboratory. To do this experiment in the laboratory, I will talk about in detail. So when two plants grow, we need to understand the plant-plant interaction, the theory behind this. So there are three types of interaction which are listed here. And then these interactions, when the plants grow, the interaction occurs above the ground and below the ground in the intercanopy region and the root zone. So this interaction can be positive or negative. Positive interaction is called facilitation. In this case, what it says is that it's beneficial. So these positions are beneficial and improve the performance of one plant from the other one, and negative, the two plants are competing. So this is observed in the plant communities. So to study this problem using the experiments, so we developed this very unique experimental facility at Colorado School of Mines, where basically you have this 8-meter long soil tank, which is the intermediate scale size I talked about earlier, and then this circulation wind tunnel where we control the boundary conditions, atmospheric conditions, we can control the wind velocity, we can control the temperature, and we can control the relative humidity. And we can measure very accurate data on the subsurface as well as the atmospheric system. So we ran these experiments in this system. So So to do that, because it's very difficult to study model plants, hydrodynamics around plants, what we did was we wrote a paper on this to see whether we could use an analog of a plant. Again, this is a challenge in some of this experiment. So what we did was we took a limestone block and we took a plant and we ran the same experiment, these two blocks, and we basically showed that the limestone block can simulate the evapotranspiration process fairly reasonably well. So the idea here is when the plant takes the water, it transfer to the leaves, and here the limestone block by capillarity take the water out and takes out. So what we did was we ran 3 experiments in this particular case. In the first experiment, we actually spaced this plant, the two blocks, 50 centimeters apart, second one 45 centimeters apart, third one 105 centimeters apart. So we can make a lot of measurements in the atmospheric systems, relative permeability, temperature, wind velocity, y and z component, the wind velocity, and the underground we can measure again temperature and soil moisture. In this particular graphs, I'm showing the relative humidity above. This one is in the atmospheric boundary layer, and this is below the soil. And you can see that immediately when these plants are very close to each other, you can watch the 25% relative humidity curve in these 3 graphs. You see they are quite different depending on the spacing. And similarly, you can see the soil moisture distribution become different depending on the spacing. And then the important thing to notice here is that both when these plants are close to each other, they have these influence zones of the plant which intercept with each other, and in the case of subsurface, the influence zones also intercept. So there are some implications of this. The idea here is that what is this out of these 3 cases which produce the most efficient use of resources by these 2 mechanisms of facilitation and competition. So to do that, actually we took this data and plotted this graph where on this axis you have the soil moisture, on this side the time, and on this is again in this case what you see here is this is the shortest spacing, the 15 centimeter. This is the intermediate. This is the largest spacing. You can see immediately that when you look at the soil moisture, that the intermediate spacing actually preserve the water the best in this case. So what we did was we plotted the soil water availability for these 3 scenarios as a function of this plant's spacing plant height ratio, where we can classify the atmospheric conditions in these different types of flow situations, skimming flow, interfering flow, and isolated roughnesses. And we found that the facilitated dominated this zone gives the highest spacing. Okay, so this is basically some general conclusion. The experiments and the intermediate scales are challenging, but provide many opportunities to address globally important problems, and driven by good theoretical foundation, innovation, and patience, and utilization of new instrumentation and sensitive technologies allow us to do very exciting experiments. And finally, I want to make the point that some of these complex problems cannot be solved just by doing modeling. It's an iterative process where you do modeling, go to the field, go to the lab, and you can learn from each of these things, and you keep iterating until you solve the problem. So finally, I turn to thank my students and collaborators and the funding agencies. And finally, I like to make this opportunity to express my gratitude to PSI-PW for recognizing the Water Scientists and Engineers Board and the board global impact makes. Personally, I have benefited. This is one of the talks I'm giving after I got the groundwater awards about 4 years ago. Actually, I was able to use this funding to do very interesting projects, which includes helping students from developing countries to go to universities, and I'm doing some work in South America looking at some water issues. So this is really a good opportunity I got because funding, and I really thank for the foundation for providing this type of support. Thank you.